Okay, so we just completed the ability to provide a token, an authorization token to our activated users. So what will we do with this authentication token? Well, what we want to do is every time a request is made, we want to attach the token that we have sent the client. Now, we also want to have the ability for an anonymous user to be able to use our service. So I'm sure you are familiar with the situation where you can use a service without having to sign up for that service. However, because you are an anonymous user, you do not have access to all the features that a registered user would have. So what we want to do now is to actually specify between these two types of users. Um, Users that will be providing an authentication token and users who are simply anonymous. All right. So that's how we split up our users. Authenticated versus anonymous. So we need to add the ability to provide for anonymous users to our system. So to do that, we will go to our data, and for users, currently we have a user, okay, but this would mean that the user has to be registered and activated. But let's now provide for the ability to have an anonymous user. Okay, so how do we create an anonymous user? Well, that shouldn't be too difficult. All I will say is, okay, so here let's declare an anonymous user. Okay, so there is no ID for this user, there's no name for this user, definitely no email, and so no password. Okay, and so I will simply create a variable named anonymous user, right? And this user will be of type user. Okay, oops, not user model but user. Okay, so this means that this user is anonymous, right? As compared to this user who will have all these things provided for them. Okay, so with that out of the way, there's one thing I want to do, and it's to add a method. Okay, and so let's come right down here. Okay, well, let's come down. Where should we do that? Okay, let's do that right here. I'll put that right here. Okay, and this is simply I want to check, okay, if a user is anonymous. Okay, so when I get sent a user, I need to know if this user is a regular user or an anonymous user. All right, and so all I will do is to create a method. Okay, and so we'll pass in a user. Okay, we're gonna pass in a user. All right, we're gonna pass in a user. And so what I want to do is to check to see if the user is This kind or this kind. Okay. So let's just say is anonymous, and it will simply return a bool, true or false. And so I'm going to simply return the user, you. I'm checking to see if that user is anonymous. Okay, that's it. Is user the same or the same type as anonymous user? Alright, so that's all we need to do. And so now we have created anonymous users and registered users. Alright, so let's move on to the next step. And the next step is where we will actually store the user details in the request context. So if you recall from the previous series, every request contains a context, okay, which tells us something about the origin of the request as well as properties of that request. And so we are able to attach key value pairs to that request. Okay, and so that's what we want to do now. Okay, so let's create a new file. And so in CMD, okay, in CMD API, we will create a new file. So let me just say touch cmd / API / context dot go. Okay, so this is where we will do the work, right, of attaching information about the user to the request before it gets to where it needs to go. Okay, so of course it means we will have to be using middleware eventually. Okay, or creating middleware. Alright, so cmd API / context dot go. Okay, so let me just import one thing because I know everything else I need will be auto imported. So I'm just going to import context. Everything else will be imported for me. So what I want to do, and this is what we tend to do, we define a custom context key type. Okay, and this is just a fancy way of saying you want to be able to add key values in an easy way. So I'm just going to create a new type. I'm going to call this type context key. Okay, and what this context key type really is a string. Okay, but instead of using a string, I'm just going to use the term context key to sort of create a level of abstraction. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is to make a user key, right? So make user a key. So that's easy enough. I'm going to say user context key is context key, and I'm going to wrap user into it. Okay, so whenever I refer to user context key, I'm simply referring to the user. Okay, so again, it's just another level of abstraction. Okay, so I now have the ability to create methods. So let me just create a method. Okay, so I'll create a method to add user to the context. Remember, the context is provided to us and we can add to that context. And so let me show you how we can do that. So I'm going to create a method of type application. Okay. Package main. Okay. So application, right? And this will be called context set user. Okay. And so what I expect is to get the request, okay, object. I need that. What I need is a user. Let me close this. I need a user. Okay. And then I will simply return a new context. Okay, so a new request. Okay, so I take the request that comes in. I have to alter it by adding the user to it. And after I have added the user to it, I will now send or create a new request. So we don't alter the original request object. We make a copy of it, add whatever we need to add, and then send that new copy. All right, we never alter the original. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's create a context which we are familiar with. And so this context will be context, but not with timeout, but context with value. All right, so it returns a copy of the parent in which the value associated with key is val. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the parent context, all right, which is R, and I will simply say user context key, all right, and so now I will simply provide the key value pair or value in our case, which is user. Okay, that's the user. And so once I have that, then it means I can now return this new context. Okay, so I will simply say r dot with context ctx. Okay, and there we have it. All right, so it returns a shallow copy of r with its context changed. All right, so for outgoing client request, the context controls the entire lifetime of our request and it responds. All right, so great. We now have the new user added, or the user information added to our context, and we can now send that along. Okay, we also want to have the ability to get the context or the user context. Okay, so I want to be able to retrieve the user struct. Okay, and so that seems easy enough. So we'll say again application, and we'll call this one context get user. Okay, and so what we need is actually the response object, the request object, sorry, which will contain that context that was added about the user. And then of course we'll simply return the user that we find in the context. Okay, so we'll say user, and then we'll say OK, and then we'll simply say r.context okay dot value. And what is the value? Well, user context key, which will be user, and of course we will now have data dot user. Okay, and so user will be a user. So assuming we can get the user out of the context, then we are okay. And that's the whole point of value, right? Value returns the value associated with this context for key. What is the key? If you recall, the key is user. Okay, and what value are we looking for? Well, we're looking for the user struct. Okay, so assuming that there is not any user, then we will need to check for that. So if not okay, false, it means that there was no user, there was no value associated with user. Okay? And so that's a problem. And so let's just panic, and I'll say missing user value in request context. All right. Okay. Otherwise, we can now safely return the user. Okay. So we have the user. We have the user. Okay. So that's all we need to do. All we did was to have the ability to set or add a user to our request object and to get the user from that object. Okay, why do we need to do that? Well, because we need to be able to find out who the user is, and once we know who the user is, we can then attach that information to our headers. Okay, so I will see you in the next lesson where we'll go ahead and use these methods in our middleware. So most of the work has to be done by the middleware. I'll see you in that video.